If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I prepared especially for you. The tavern was dim and loud, filled with the heavy smell of smoke, wine, and damp wool. Clay lamps burned low, their light bending across sweating faces. Rough laughter mixed with the scrape of dice and the clatter of wooden mugs. In a corner near the back, a man in a worn soldier's cloak sat alone at a long table. Marcus Vero, veteran of the 10th Legion. His armor rested beside him, dented and patched with rivets that showed years of marching, fighting, and surviving. He had been stationed in Antioch for months, waiting for reassignment after a campaign that left half his cohort buried under Syrian dust. The army had no further use for men like him. Too many scars, too little discipline left to beat out. The tavern became his shelter from the noise of memory. He came not for pleasure, but for quiet between the shouting and the orders that still echoed in his head. The dice in his hand were smooth from use. He rolled them slowly, not for greed or excitement, but to keep his hands occupied. Every time the cubes struck the table, he felt a momentary release, a distraction from the weight pressing on his chest. Across from him sat a group of traders and fellow soldiers, their eyes glassy from cheap wine. One of them, Lucius Septimus, a merchant with fine sandals but trembling fingers, leaned too close to the table. His debts had grown with every roll, his speech slurring with desperation. The man's silk tunic, once bright, was now stained with sweat and wine. "One more round," Lucius muttered. "I'll win it back. Fortuna won't curse me twice." Marcus said nothing. He rolled again. The dice favored him, as they had all evening. A few coins clinked across the wood. The merchant cursed under his breath and stared into his empty purse. The tavern quieted a little as he looked around, searching for anything left to wager. Then he spoke, too loud, too fast. "I have something of value still," he said. The words came out with the smell of wine. "My daughter, a fine young woman, trained, obedient, worth more than coin." A few men laughed, thinking it a jest, but Marcus didn't. He raised his head for the first time and saw the merchant's face. Pale, shaking, not joking. Near the doorway stood the girl, Livia. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, the nails pressed white into her skin. She wore a simple linen dress, travel-worn but clean, and a thin bronze brooch fastened her cloak. Her eyes darted between her father and the soldier, uncertain whether to run or plead. Marcus's jaw tightened. He wanted to stand up and leave. This was not what he came here for. But the crowd pressed in, waiting, their drunken curiosity hanging heavy in the air. Someone slammed a mug on the table. "Play, soldier. Fortuna's watching." He hesitated, not out of greed, but out of something darker, the dull habit of obedience. Orders, games, things done because others expected them. He threw the dice once more. They bounced twice, spun, and came to rest, 2 sixes. The sound of the tavern broke off. Even a man at the counter stopped pouring. Marcus didn't move. He stared at the dice for a long time, as if hoping they would change. Lucius went silent, his lips trembling. Livia's breath caught in her throat. Marcus finally looked up. "You shouldn't have said that," he told the merchant quietly. His voice was calm but rough, the tone of a man too tired to argue. Lucius's eyes filled with panic. He tried to laugh, to turn it into a joke, but no one joined him. He grabbed his cup, drank, and stumbled toward the door, muttering excuses. He didn't look at his daughter as he passed her. Livia stood still, her face drained of color. Her voice came out low and trembling. "What happens now?" Marcus rose slowly from his seat, his armor clinking as he fastened the strap across his chest. He glanced at the doorway where the merchant had vanished. "You can't stay here," he said. She looked down, silent. There was no one else left in the room willing to take her side. Marcus paid for the wine and stepped out into the street. The night air smelled of dust and cooking fires. Behind him, Livia followed at a distance, unsure whether she was walking into safety or servitude. Marcus didn't look back. He didn't want a slave. He didn't want company. But the sound of her footsteps behind him wouldn't stop. And for the first time in months, he didn't feel completely alone, only burdened by a sense of responsibility he hadn't asked for, yet couldn't ignore. The lamps flickered as they disappeared down the narrow road, the tavern's noise fading behind them. Neither spoke. The dice were still on the table inside, showing 12, a perfect throw that felt like anything but luck. The dawn was cold when Marcus left the tavern row behind. The city of Antioch still slept under a layer of gray mist, its streets littered with broken pottery and the faint echo of last night's noise. He walked with a soldier's habit, steady pace, eyes scanning, hands free. Behind him, Livia followed at a distance, her steps uneven. She had not spoken since the night before, and he had not tried to speak to her. They reached the edge of the city where the Legion's camp was being dismantled. Rows of tents stood half-collapsed, and mules brayed as soldiers loaded wagons. The smell of pitch, leather, and iron hung in the air. Marcus had planned to rejoin his cohort that morning and move east toward the next outpost. He hadn't planned for a girl to be trailing behind him like a shadow. He stopped near the camp's outer ditch. "You shouldn't have followed," he said without turning. His tone was flat, not cruel, but tired, the voice of a man who had given too many orders and seen too many ignored. "I have nowhere else to go," she answered quietly. The words came slowly, as if she had rehearsed them all night. "He left me. My father." Marcus finally looked at her. Her cloak was too thin for the morning cold, her sandals dusty from the long walk, and her eyes, the kind that carried more disbelief than tears, met his with a strange steadiness. He saw no deceit, only fear covered by pride. He exhaled through his nose, adjusting the strap of his armor. "You stay with the camp for now. No promises beyond that." She nodded. When they entered the encampment, the other soldiers turned to look. Legionaries were not used to seeing a woman near the ranks unless she was a laundress, a traitor, or worse. Whispers followed them. "Who's the girl? Another debtor's child?" Vero found himself a prize. Marcus ignored every word. At the quartermaster's table, he registered her as Ancilla, servant. It was the only way to keep her under the Legion's protection. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Your property, then?" he asked. Marcus hesitated a fraction of a second before answering. "By law, yes. In truth, no." He didn't elaborate, and the officer didn't ask further. He led her to his tent, a small, plain structure on the outer ring of the camp, away from the main road. "You'll stay here," he said. "I'll find another place to sleep." She looked around the tent, unsure. "This is your place." "It was," he replied. Then he turned and walked out, taking his blanket and gear. That night, Marcus slept near the campfire under the open sky, the sound of distant marching filling the silence. He thought of the merchant, Lucius Septimus, a man so consumed by debt he had gambled away his own blood. Marcus had seen worse in campaigns, yet something about this felt heavier. He could face death easily. This felt like obligation, and obligation demanded endurance. In the following days, routine returned. The Legion broke camp, marching east through the rough plains where the ground cracked under the sun. Livia kept to the rear of the column, silent, carrying a small pack of provisions Marcus had given her. When the soldiers rested, she washed their cups and fetched water, learning quickly how to move unnoticed. Some of the younger men teased her at first. Careless remarks meant to provoke, but she never replied, and Marcus's presence nearby was enough to keep them quiet. He didn't speak in her defense. He didn't need to. His silence carried more weight than anger. At dusk, when the day's march ended, Marcus sat apart, cleaning his armor with slow, methodical strokes. Livia approached once, holding out his repaired cloak. The fabric had been torn at the shoulder seam, now neatly stitched. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "You gave me shelter," she answered simply. He took the cloak from her, their fingers brushing for an instant. She withdrew her hand quickly, unsure if she had crossed a line. He didn't scold her, only gave a short nod. As the weeks passed, a rhythm formed, unspoken but steady. She set aside his ration each morning, left his tools organized, and stayed near his tent when the soldiers grew restless at night. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was in short, calm sentences that carried more thought than warmth. Yet beneath that restraint, she sensed something constant, a kind of tired decency that didn't fit with the stories told about legionaries. One evening, under a pale sky, she finally gathered the courage to ask, "Why didn't you leave me there?" He was mending a strap, the leather stretched tight in his hands. He paused for a moment before answering. "Because someone should have taken you, and I didn't trust any of them to do it right." She looked down at her hands, clasped together as if holding something fragile. "So I belong to you now." His gaze lingered on her face for a long moment. "No," he said. "You just walk beside me until you can stand on your own." It wasn't affection, nor kindness exactly. It was a line drawn in quiet understanding. That night, Livia fell asleep inside the tent, while Marcus remained outside by the fire, awake for hours, watching the stars burn faintly above the empty plain. He didn't know yet what he had taken responsibility for, only that he couldn't bring himself to regret it. By the time the camp slept, the sound of her breathing mixed with the wind. It was the first time in months that the silence around Marcus didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a beginning he didn't ask for, but one he could no longer avoid. The march east continued for weeks. The Legion moved like a living machine, shields glinting under the hard sun, banners rising and falling in the dust. The air carried the metallic tang of sweat, iron, and burned oil from the armorer's tents. Marcus walked in silence, his mind fixed on the rhythm of the march, the steady sound of sandals grinding against the dry earth. Livia followed the baggage line, her pace cautious but determined. She had learned quickly how to ration water, how to wrap cloth around her sandals to keep the stones out, how to hide her fear when the horizon filled with smoke. At first, the soldiers had watched her with curiosity, a merchant's daughter turned servant in a Legion camp. But curiosity faded with time. She became part of the background, one of the countless lives swallowed by Rome's endless roads. Marcus had not told her where they were headed, and she hadn't asked. Still, she noticed things. The way the centurion spoke of unrest near the border. The way Marcus's gaze hardened each time scouts returned dusty and tense. Something waited ahead, and every man felt it. At night, the campfires dotted the valley like small fortresses of light. Marcus sat near one, his armor unbuckled, methodically scraping dirt from his sword's edge. His movements were deliberate, not ritual, but habit born from years of repetition. Livia brought him water, setting the cup beside him before sitting down a few steps away. "You fought in Judea?" she asked softly. He looked at her, surprised. "How do you know that?" "The scar on your arm," she said. "It's deep, like a cut from a curved blade." He flexed his arm, the muscles shifting under the scar. "Yes, years ago, before the Legion sent me here." He paused, lowering his voice. "Half my unit didn't come back." She didn't press further, but the silence between them changed, heavier, more honest. Marcus studied her for a moment. "Your father," he said. "What kind of man was he before all this?" She hesitated, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "He was proud," she said. "Too proud to admit he'd lost everything. The debt started after my mother died. I think he stopped caring what happened next." She drew her knees to her chest, voice trembling slightly. "When he offered me to you, I thought it was a joke. I waited for him to take it back. But he didn't." Marcus stared into the flames. "Men can lose their sense of honor faster than they lose their coin," he said quietly. "But that doesn't make it right." She looked at him for a long time, trying to understand him. He wasn't kind, not in the way stories describe kindness. But there was something steady in him, something that made her feel, for the first time, that she wasn't entirely invisible. Days later, they reached a narrow valley lined with olive trees and dry stone walls. The Legion set up camp near an abandoned village, charred rooftops, empty wells, and the faint smell of old smoke. The villagers had fled months ago, leaving behind a silence that clung to everything. Livia helped gather firewood while Marcus checked the perimeter with his sentry. That night, as the wind shifted, she noticed him sitting apart from the others again. His eyes followed the flames, but his mind was far away. She approached, holding a small loaf of barley bread. "You didn't eat," she said, setting it beside him. He shook his head. I've had worse meals than an empty stomach. She smiled faintly, the first time he had seen her smile at all. You sound like a man who's trying to convince himself of that. His mouth twitched slightly, the ghost of a smile in return. Maybe I am. They sat in silence. The fire crackled, and from somewhere down the slope came the faint sound of laughter. Men telling stories to keep the night away. Livia stared into the flames, then asked, "Will they ever send you home?" Marcus took a deep breath. "Home," he repeated, almost to himself. "Rome isn't home. Not anymore. You fight long enough, and you forget where that is." She studied him, realizing how little she actually knew about this man who had taken her from a life she hadn't chosen, yet somehow given her one that felt more real than the one she left behind. Later that night, as she lay on her blanket inside the tent, she heard him shifting outside, the sound of armor plates settling and boots pressing into the soil. He kept watch long after the camp fell silent. She wondered what kind of man did that for someone he didn't own, someone he barely knew. When morning came, the sky was pale and cold. The standard bearer called for formation. Marcus helped her load a small pack onto the mule. "Stay close today," he said. "We're near the frontier. Not all who live out here welcome the eagle banners." Livia nodded, tightening her cloak. "I'll keep close." As they moved out, she walked beside him rather than behind him for the first time. He didn't tell her to fall back. And though neither said a word, something between them had changed. Not spoken, not defined, but they're all the same. Behind them, the valley disappeared into the haze, and ahead, the road cut through endless hills. The march continued, but now the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was the kind of silence that held meaning, the kind that felt like the beginning of trust. The road turned rough as the Legion advanced deeper into the frontier. The soil was dry and pale, the air carrying the scent of dust and olive ash. Each mile brought fewer villages and more open land. Endless hills where the wind spoke louder than men. The soldiers grew quieter, their laughter fading with every camp built and torn down again. Even horses seemed restless, sensing the tension beneath the calm routine. Marcus walked near the front ranks, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges. He had learned long ago that quiet land often hid the most danger. He was no longer a young man, but his instincts were sharp, sharpened by years of surviving campaigns where mistakes cost lives. He noticed the smallest things: a broken fence, the glint of metal on a hill, tracks half buried in the dust. Behind him, Livia had changed too. The fear in her eyes had not vanished, but it had transformed into alertness. She had learned how to walk without stumbling, how to sense tension before the men around her did. She carried herself differently now, still cautious, but no longer fragile. The soldiers had also changed their tone toward her. No more laughter or crude remarks. They had seen her endure the march, the hunger, the exhaustion. When she passed by, some nodded in quiet respect. She had become, in their eyes, part of the Legion, an unusual presence, but one accepted. At the next camp, built along a dried-up riverbed, Marcus was summoned to the command tent. He returned late, his expression dark. Livia waited outside his tent, pretending to clean a cooking pot. When he finally approached, she looked up. "What did they tell you?" He dropped a bundle of maps on the ground. "There's trouble ahead. Rebel raiders moving through the hills, Syrians, maybe deserters. We're to reinforce the patrol line." Her voice lowered. "You'll be fighting again?" He hesitated before answering. "If it comes to that." She nodded slowly. "You've done this before." He looked at her for a moment. "Too many times. But it's never the same." That night, the camp was restless. Orders moved from tent to tent. Armor was checked, weapons sharpened. The air carried the metallic clink of swords being tested against shields. Livia tried to sleep, but couldn't. Through the tent's flap, she saw Marcus sitting by the fire, his face half lit by the flames. He held a small bronze token in his hand, an old coin drilled through with a cord. She had never seen him hold it before. He noticed her watching. "A friend gave it to me," he said quietly, turning the coin between his fingers. "Before we marched on Jerusalem. Said it would bring luck." "Did it?" she asked. He looked down. "He died the next morning." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence born from understanding. Two people who had both lost more than they could name. When dawn came, the sky was pale gold. Marcus joined the patrols heading north. Before he left, he told her to stay with the supply wagons and not wander off. "If we don't return by nightfall," he said, fastening his helmet, "ride south with the quartermaster. Do you understand?" She wanted to argue, but didn't. She only nodded. "Come back," she said. "I'll try." His answer was honest, not reassuring. Hours passed. The sun rose high and harsh, turning the stones white. The camp grew tense as distant horns echoed through the hills. Livia waited near the wagons, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She wasn't sure what she was praying for, that the Legion would win, or simply that Marcus would survive. When the patrol returned at dusk, their ranks were thinner. The men were silent, their armor stained with dust and blood. Marcus wasn't among them. Livia's chest tightened. She ran from group to group, searching every face. The officer she recognized from Marcus's unit looked at her and shook his head. "He's alive," he said quickly, seeing her expression. "Wounded. They're bringing him on the cart." She turned and saw him, lying on his side, blood dark on his tunic, one hand clutching the edge of the wagon. His face was pale but calm. When she reached him, he forced a faint smile. "It's not deep," he muttered. "Just hurts like it is." She climbed onto the cart beside him. "You shouldn't talk," she said, her voice breaking. He gave a weak laugh. "That's the first time anyone's told me that." When they reached camp, she refused to let anyone else tend to him. The medics wanted to move him to the infirmary tent, but she insisted. "I'll care for him," she said, her tone steady in a way that surprised even herself. She cleaned his wound, bandaged it with torn linen, and sat beside him through the night. Every time he stirred, she was there, cooling his forehead with water and keeping his hand from trembling. At one point, near midnight, his voice came weakly. "You could have left. You should have. I told you I'd stay," she whispered. "And I meant it." For the first time, he didn't argue. His hand relaxed in hers, and his breathing steadied. By morning, the fever had broken. He opened his eyes and saw her asleep beside the cot, head resting on her arms. Sunlight filtered through the tent's flap, falling across her hair. For a long moment, Marcus just watched. Not as a soldier, not as a man burdened by orders, but as someone who had finally remembered what peace looked like. He knew then that the question of why he had taken her no longer mattered. It wasn't about debt or duty anymore. It was about something quieter, something human, the fragile certainty that two broken lives could hold each other together in a world built on loss. Outside, the horns called for formation. Inside, he reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his hand trembling slightly. Then he whispered to no one in particular, "I'll come back again." The war wasn't over, but something inside him had shifted, a reason to survive, clear and unspoken. And for the first time since the tavern in Antioch, Marcus Vero didn't feel like a man passing through life. He felt like someone who finally had somewhere to return to. Marcus spent the following days confined to the tent, his wound slowly closing under Livia's careful hands. The medic's linen wrappings had been replaced with cleaner ones she washed and dried herself. She moved with calm precision, though the tremor in her fingers betrayed her worry. Every time she looked at him, her eyes lingered a second too long, making sure he was still breathing, still alive. The Legion had suffered more than the commanders admitted. Whispers spread through the camp, of ambushes in the hills, of patrols vanishing into the scrubland and not returning. The men spoke in lowered voices now, laughter replaced by the rhythmic clink of armor and the short, clipped orders of officers pretending to be in control. Marcus knew the tone well. He had heard it before, the sound of an army pretending it wasn't afraid. He could walk again by the fifth day, but his steps were slow and pain still pressed under his ribs. Livia stayed close, never asking when they would move, never questioning what came next. One afternoon, as the heat drove most soldiers into the shade, she sat by the tent entrance, repairing one of his tunics with a thin bronze needle. Her voice broke the silence. "Why do you stay in the army?" He didn't answer immediately. He was sharpening his gladius, the steady motion of the whetstone across the blade filling the space between them. "Because it's what I know," he said finally, "and because Rome doesn't let go of its soldiers easily. They say a man can leave the Legion, but the Legion never leaves him." She nodded, still sewing. "Do you believe in what they fight for?" His jaw tightened. "I used to. Then I learned what Rome calls peace often begins with fire." She looked up, studying his expression. There was no bitterness in his tone, only the quiet exhaustion of a man who had seen too much and stopped pretending to understand why. That evening, the commander announced they would march at first light. The wounded who could not travel would be left in a fortified post with a small garrison. Marcus, though not fully healed, refused to stay behind. When the medic argued, he simply said, "If I can walk, I can fight." Before dawn, Livia helped him fasten his armor. She adjusted the straps with care, her hands steady against the rough metal. "You shouldn't go," she said quietly. "You're not ready." He met her eyes. "No one ever is." Then, after a pause, he added, "Stay near the supply line. If anything happens, don't wait for me. You understand?" She wanted to tell him she wouldn't, that she would never walk away again, but she said nothing, only nodded. The march was long and slow. The sun rose hot over the hills, burning the morning mist away. The Legion moved in tight formation, their shields glinting like mirrors. By midday, they reached a narrow pass flanked by rocky slopes. The air was still, too still. Marcus's instincts tightened. He raised his hand, signaling a halt. Then the first arrow came. It struck a soldier ahead of him square in the throat. Chaos erupted. Raiders poured from the cliffs, a mix of deserters and local fighters armed with curved blades and bows. The Legion's line broke under the sudden attack. Marcus drew his sword, shouting orders, rallying what men he could. The battle was a blur of sound and motion. Iron clashing, dust rising, men falling. Through the smoke, Marcus saw the supply line collapsing in the rear. Livia was there, trapped between wagons as soldiers scrambled for cover. Without thought, he pushed through the melee, blocking arrows with his shield, cutting down two raiders who came too close. A blade slashed across his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He reached her just as a raider lunged with a spear. Marcus stepped between them, driving his sword through the man's chest. The spear struck him in the side as the raider fell. He dropped to one knee, gasping. Livia caught him before he fell completely. "Marcus!" she cried, pressing her hand against the wound. The blood was hot and thick under her fingers. He looked at her, eyes sharp despite the pain. "Listen to me," he said, voice breaking. "You're free. Leave this place." She shook her head, tears cutting through the dust on her cheeks. "No, I'm not leaving you." He tried to speak again, but his breath caught. She held him tightly, refusing to let go. Around them, the sounds of battle began to fade, the Legion regaining its ground, the raiders fleeing into the hills. When the dust finally settled, the air was thick with the smell of iron and smoke. Livia stayed by him until the medics arrived. She refused to move as they lifted him onto a cart, holding his hand until her knuckles went white. He drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey back to camp. Sometimes he heard her voice, quiet, steady, refusing to break. Other times he heard nothing but the dull rhythm of the wheels over stone. When he finally woke again, it was night. The fire outside the tent crackled softly. Livia sat beside him, her clothes still stained with dirt and blood, but her eyes alert. "You should have run," he whispered. She shook her head. "You should stop expecting me to." He let out a weak breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Then he looked at her, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. "You're not the same girl I met in that tavern." "No," she said softly. "And you're not the same man who won me." For a long time, neither spoke. The wind pressed against the tent walls, carrying the smell of rain and the faint rhythm of soldiers rebuilding the camp outside. Livia reached out and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "We're alive," she said. "That's enough for now." He nodded slowly, the pain easing in his chest. For the first time, he didn't feel like a soldier speaking to someone under his protection. He felt like a man speaking to someone who had saved him. And though neither said the words aloud, Both understood that what tied them together now was not chance or debt, but choice. The kind that could not be undone, even by Rome. The rain came 2 days after the battle. Hard, sudden, and cleansing. It washed the blood from the camp and turned the ground into dark mud. The legion buried their dead on the hillside overlooking the valley, marking each grave with a wooden spear shaft. Marcus stood among them, his arm bound and his side wrapped in linen. The medic had warned him to rest, but he refused to remain in the tent. He wanted to see their faces one last time. The men who had followed orders without question, the men who wouldn't march again. Livia stood a few paces behind, holding a cloak over her head against the rain. She watched him, knowing he carried a weight heavier than his wound. When the soldiers began to leave, Marcus stayed behind. She walked up quietly and stopped beside him. "You can't carry them all," she said softly. "I know," he replied, his voice low, "but I owe them more than a prayer." "You already paid," she said. "You lived. That's enough." He turned to her then, his eyes tired but steady. For the first time, she didn't see the soldier. She saw the man beneath the armor, a man who had been surviving for too long without knowing why. That evening, the commander dismissed Marcus from duty. His service was over. The campaign was ending, the frontier stabilizing. Rome would send new men, younger and hungrier for glory. Marcus had earned his missio honesta, an honorable discharge. The seal on the parchment carried the eagle of the legion, but it felt more like a farewell than a reward. When he returned to the tent, Livia was packing what little they had, his spare tunic, her cloak, a few tools, a loaf of hard bread. She looked up when he entered. "Where will you go now?" He set the scroll down on the table and sat on the edge of the cot. "Away from the army," he said. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere that doesn't smell like iron and death." She paused, unsure how to ask the question forming in her throat. "And me?" He met her gaze. "You're free, Livia. You've been free since the day I said it." Her hands froze over the bundle. "And if I don't want to go?" He studied her face, the same woman who had once stood in a tavern doorway, terrified and silent. Now her eyes were clear, her shoulders steady. He realized then that she had changed just as much as he had. "Then you stay," he said simply. They left the camp at dawn. The road south cut through dry hills, lined with olive groves and broken walls from older wars. They walked beside a small wagon, carrying supplies for a nearby village. Marcus's steps were slower, his strength still returning, but he didn't complain. Livia matched his pace, neither leading nor following. After days of travel, they reached the coast, a quiet settlement built near the ruins of an old fort. The sea stretched out like hammered bronze under the noon sun. The villagers were simple folk, fishermen, traders, widows of soldiers. They offered work to Marcus as a blacksmith, impressed by the scars on his hands and the discipline in his posture. He took it without hesitation. They rented a small stone house near the shore. The roof leaked and the hearth smoked, but it was enough. Marcus repaired the forge behind the house, using tools the villagers had abandoned years ago. The first time he struck the hammer against the anvil, he felt a weight lift from his chest. The sound was steady, honest, alive. Livia spent her days helping where she could, mending nets, trading bread for salt, learning to tend the small garden behind the house. The villagers accepted her easily. Her calmness disarmed them. No one asked where she came from, and she never volunteered the story. At night, they sat outside, the air filled with the hiss of waves against the rocks. Marcus would clean his tools while Livia combed her hair, the quiet between them no longer heavy with things unsaid. One evening, she looked at him across the small fire. "Do you ever think of Rome?" He shook his head. "Rome thinks of itself enough for everyone. I'm done serving it. And the army?" He paused, his eyes on the flames. "The army took everything I had, but it gave me one thing back." "What's that?" He looked up, meeting her gaze. "You." The words hung in the air, simple, unpolished, and final. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The warmth in her eyes said everything. In the months that followed, their lives settled into quiet rhythm. The forge's glow lit their nights, and the smell of salt and burning coal filled the air. The scars on Marcus's body healed, but those in his mind took longer. Livia never pushed him to speak of the past. She understood that silence, sometimes, was its own kind of healing. When the first spring came, the fields beyond the village turned green again. Children ran along the shore, chasing gulls, and the sound of laughter replaced the echo of marching boots. One morning, Marcus woke to find Livia already outside, hanging wet cloth to dry in the sun. She looked over her shoulder and smiled. It was a simple thing, the kind of smile born not from relief, but from peace. He stepped out, the smell of the sea in his lungs, and realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't preparing for another march, another order, another loss. He was exactly where he wanted to be. That night, as they sat together watching the horizon, the light faded over the water, turning everything gold. The wind shifted cool and calm. Livia leaned her head on his shoulder, and he let out a slow breath. Not the sigh of a weary soldier, but the quiet exhale of a man who had finally stopped running. There was no grand ending, no victory parade, no speech. Only peace, the rare kind that came not from triumph, but from choosing to stay when everything else told them to move on. And as the last light of day touched the sea, Marcus realized what neither of them had said aloud. The game that had begun with a throw of dice had ended here, not with luck, but with the simplest and rarest thing Rome had never given him, a life worth keeping.